Hey everybody, I recently watched Da Joker Lady and I really didn't like it. Now for context, I've done a pretty good job of steering clear of these Disney live action remakes slash reimaginings of their classic properties since Beauty and the Beast. The goal of making something that at least stands apart from the original was clearly abandoned with that movie to just spam the nostalgia button in people's brains, which is why this movie caught my attention just a little bit when it seemed like they were doing something a little different, even if it was derivative of other things. Plus, I never had much of an attachment to 101 Dalmatians. However, this is a good example of why different doesn't automatically equal good. I'll make it clear before I get into my actual thoughts that I'm not judging anyone for liking this movie. I'm clearly in the minority of the overall public reception of this, and I'm just explaining why I personally don't like it. I will say that the costume and makeup design was actually pretty impressive, and the two leads seemed like they were at least trying their best with the garbage script that they were given, but that's about where my compliments end. Let's get my biggest criticism out of the way first. This movie follows the same strategy as that Maleficent movie with Angelina Jolie. They were both pretty much advertised as
witness the origin of one of Disney's most evil villains.
but then they removed the villainous traits of their characters. Cruella is just the hero of this story, albeit a mischievous and unstable one, but a hero nonetheless. If she was actually an evil protagonist, I would have at least respected the movie for committing to the character, but they didn't, and I have no idea how more people aren't pointing out this blatant false advertising. And more importantly, from a storytelling perspective, how does removing her villainous archetype improve the story in any way? I made a goof at the start of this video about it being derivative of Joker, but that movie actually delivered on the villain part of the villain origin story, you know? Speaking of things this movie is derivative of, the actual villain provides essentially the same conflict as The Devil Wears Prada, if it was a soap opera that was stripped of any and all subtlety. I guess you could call this movie The DeVille Wears Prada. A joke that I'm sure hasn't been made at least 100 times already. Genuinely, the most entertaining part of this movie was watching Emma Thompson hold the same facial expression for 90% of her screen time. I'd also like to point out that her character is pretty exclusively addressed as just the Baroness. Like, if she has a last name, I don't think it was ever spoken out loud. Then at the end of the movie, Cruella and her crew obtain her mansion and remove the sign on the gate that says Von Hellman Hall, and I was like, oh, I guess that was her last name? The movie forgot to tell me. What I'm trying to say is this movie somehow has a bad case of not communicating properly with the audience, even though there's a number of scenes where characters might as well have just looked straight into the camera and said, okay, audience, here's how you're supposed to feel about this new plot development. I'm just gonna hold your hand and make sure you know what's going on. Besides the two leads, every other character was pretty much written and played like a live-action cartoon, and it got really irritating. The fat sidekick was particularly grating. His personality is that he's fat and he likes dogs, I guess. It's painfully obvious that he's this movie's lightning rod for cheap gags or lazy jokes, and also there were genuinely times that I couldn't understand what he was saying because his accent was so thick. Oi, governor, what was this I heard? I'm the comedic dispenser, I am, and I can't. Apart from character stuff, they also failed to do anything impressive with the filmmaking, despite this movie having a budget listed somewhere between $100 and $200 million. Wow, that money could have gone toward fighting poverty or rebuilding our infrastructure or something. Instead, we got Cruella. Yeah. The cinematography was bland, and the only interesting shot that I can remember was one that Citizen Kane did better 80 years ago, so don't consider me impressed. Probably the only time this movie's ever gonna be mentioned in the same breath as Citizen Kane, by the way. The visual palette was overly dark and ugly, the visual effects shots were mediocre at best, and the CGI Dalmatians looked weird and off-putting. I could get into a lot more things that just plain don't make no sense, but I feel like that's more effort than is worth it for this movie. Like I said at the beginning, I never even had much of a connection with 101 Dalmatians, so the fact that this movie made me as upset as it did shows me that I'm right and will continue to be right to avoid these remakes as long as they keep getting made, especially for the ones that I actually care about the original. Anyway, I thought this movie was really poorly made overall, and the fact that it was successful in the post-COVID world and actually well received by critics somehow means that they're not gonna stop with these sharded out Disney remakes anytime soon. And I'm giving Cruella a 2 out of 10.